Hey everyone, welcome to the Optispan podcast. Today's episode might be a little bit controversial. I don't know. There are certainly some people who may not like it, but what I want to talk about are epigenetic age tests. And in particular, I'm going to show you the results of an experiment that I did that was really aimed at addressing how accurate and precise are these tests in general. And I think my primary reason for doing this is that I've expressed some skepticism about not only are these tests actually measuring biological age, but again, really how accurate and precise are they? Can we get any really good quantitative data? And particularly, I'm referring to the direct-to-consumer epigenetic tests. So if you're one of the people who believes these tests have value, I'd ask you to consider first why you believe that. What is the information that is making you believe that a test that you can buy over the internet to supposedly measure your biological age is actually measuring your biological age? What is the evidence that any of these consumer-facing tests really tell you anything about your health or anything else for that matter? And I'm not saying that they don't, but I think it's always worth exploring why we believe what we believe. And in this case, I think that exercise may be informative. My personal guess is that you won't actually be able to point to any real evidence that demonstrates accuracy or precision for any of the direct-to-consumer biological age tests that are out there. I haven't found any, at least, and that's the incentive for me doing this experiment that I'm going to tell you about. If you think you've got some evidence, please leave it in the comment section. As far as I can tell, it's really based largely on these companies telling you that their tests measure biological age without much, if any, evidence to actually support those claims, or it's influencers trying to convince you that their protocol works. And my guess is, and I'll tell you why I believe this towards the end of this video, my guess is in most of those cases, these folks are cherry picking which biological age results that they share with you. So in any case, I figured I'd do an experiment, find out for myself. And the design of my experiment is really simple. I got 2 epigenetic age kits, each from 4 different companies that offer different epigenetic age tests. I took the saliva and blood samples, depending on which biological fluid they use, on the same day. Sent in all 8 kits, got the results back. And that's what I'm going to share with you. And I think it ended up being interesting and informative. So I would say if you've ever taken one of these tests or you're thinking about using one of these tests, you should watch this video, see how it comes out. So let's take a step back first and start with the big questions. I think there are a few. So I think one question is, in the best possible scenario, could any of these direct-to-consumer biological age tests actually measure biological aging? That's a bigger question, but obviously really important to this entire conversation and to the entire field. So that's number one. Number two, how accurately do they measure biological age? Number three, what is their precision? And I'll get a bit more into the distinction between accuracy and precision in a minute. And number four, and this is the one I want to start with, what are some of the incentives and potentially conflicts of interest in the industry that could impact you as the consumers? And I mean, the fact is, these are all for-profit companies, nothing wrong with that. But they are for-profit, and they are largely working outside of any real regulatory landscape by offering these tests really for entertainment value only. I think all of these companies, or at least most of them, are really careful not to cross the line into claiming that these tests have any diagnostic value or that they're medical value or that they are medical information. But they clearly market them in a way that is designed to make you believe that they have diagnostic and medical value, or at least value in terms of telling you something about your health. And again, if you believe that, I'd simply ask you to carefully think about why you believe that. What data have you seen that makes you believe that these tests are telling you something important about your health or your likelihood of developing diseases or potentially dying? And I'll just tell you, as someone who knows probably more than 99.9% of the general population about the inner workings of these tests, I was skeptical going into this experiment. The conflicts of interest I'm referring to, I think in some ways are much more insidious than just the questions that I've posed around accuracy and precision. And also, I would suggest around quality control, which is maybe a little bit of a different issue. Um, what I'm referring to here is that many of these companies also sell other products, often supplements, for which there is little to no evidence that they have any health benefits. And they co-market these things in ways that I find problematic, often using the results of these tests to then tell you that you should buy their supplements or their other products. To me, this is a real credibility problem, and personally, I wish these companies would stop co-marketing in that way. I think it's a real problem when the people who are selling the tests that haven't been validated in any way are then using the results of those tests to tell you to buy something else that hasn't been validated in any real way. Maybe that's just me. So let's talk about the three questions I posed. The first one, do these tests, or could they, in the best possible scenario, actually measure biological aging? The answer to this, I think, is complicated. If you're kind of unsure, like what is the difference between chronological age and biological age, I would encourage you to check out the episode on the podcast where we really do a deep dive into those concepts and how you might measure those things. Suffice it to say that, biological age is meant to represent how well your tissues, cells, organs are functioning, and can be different from chronological age, which is just the length of time that you've been alive or the number of birthdays that you have had. So could these tests measure biological age? And I think the answer, to be fair, is they measure a part of what we understand about biological aging today. So they are specifically measuring epigenetic marks, and specifically methylation marks on top of our genome. That's why they're called epigenetic age tests. And these epigenetic marks control which genes are expressed, which genes are turned off, how highly different genes are expressed. So they regulate gene expression. And scientists have discovered that the changes in the methylation patterns happen in a characteristic way as we age. So you can develop signatures just looking at methylation of chronological age that, somewhat predictive for chronological age. And then you can measure other signatures that are somewhat predictive for, we believe, future health outcomes. And those have been described as biological aging metrics. I think one thing to appreciate, first of all, is this is just a subset of biological aging. We don't know, the epigenetic changes 10% of biological aging, or are they 80%? We don't know. I think if you look at the hallmarks of aging, epigenetic changes are one of the 12 hallmarks of aging. So they're at least 1/12, maybe. My intuition is they are important, but not fundamental root drivers of all biological aging. So I would say the best these tests could do, if they were working perfectly, is measure a part of biological aging. And is it a small part or a large part? I don't think we know the answer to that yet. So I think the other piece that's important here, though, is to recognize these epigenetic signatures, these epigenetic clocks, are correlations of correlations, right? So, and what I mean by that is these clocks have been developed largely by looking at what we call longitudinal samples. So samples that were, say, taken on a population of people, let's just say 1,000 people. We have blood samples in the freezer from 20 years ago. We can measure the epigenetic marks on their DNA in those samples. And then we can look and see what happened to those people over the next 20 years. Some of them have died. Some of them have developed heart disease. Some have developed cancer. Some have developed diabetes. And we can make correlative signatures between the epigenetic marks and which people developed which diseases and which people died. That's how these biological age clocks have been developed. But of course, death, disease all go along with biological aging, but you can develop those things independent of biological aging. And so that's what I mean by a correlation to a correlation. They aren't directly measuring biological aging. And at least to date, we don't have any direct mechanistic evidence connecting specific methylation changes with biological aging, or even with some of these other outcomes that are correlations with biological aging, disease incidence or mortality. So at best, it's a correlation of a correlation that measures part of biological aging. I do think there's value there. I think these are very powerful research tools, but just recognize they are absolutely not and couldn't be, even if done perfectly, really comprehensive measures of biological aging. The one thing also that I think about is because these clocks have all been developed from longitudinal samples, many taken decades ago, or at least 10 years ago, is that the human environment is changing at an accelerating pace. And our environment now is very different than our environment 20 years ago, is very different than our environment 40 years ago. Just look at pictures of people 40 years ago. You didn't see obesity anywhere near the frequency that you see it today. That is all environmentally driven. And so the epigenetic correlations with health outcomes 20 years ago may be different than the epigenetic correlations with health outcomes today. And this is one of the limitations to not actually measuring biological age, but measuring health outcomes or mortality. So it's complicated. I get it. Again, I think that the take home is, at the very best, these tests could measure part of biological aging and could tell you something about health risks, but it's not going to tell you everything. So the last thing I'll say about this first point is, again, I think these epigenetic clocks work reasonably well in the research setting, and that's how they've been designed. I think they're useful research tools. They're going to get better as we start to draw these mechanistic connections. However, the companies that are selling these things direct to consumer are operating completely outside of the research setting. And unfortunately, they have largely provided no transparency on quality control. They aren't really regulated. They aren't CLIA certified. We really have no way of knowing what they're doing. Like, are they using good laboratory practices? Are they actually analyzing the samples? Are they throwing them in the garbage? And just making numbers up? I don't think that's what they're doing. I don't believe that. But we don't know. That's the point. And so again, I think there's a confusion. People often want to believe that these epigenetic tests are valid because they have been used, or versions of them have been used. The algorithm, the computational part, has been used in peer-reviewed papers, but there's really no transparency around the laboratory part. So that's another reason for uncertainty that I think you should be aware of and you should think about. And again, I don't think any of these companies are intentionally, I think they have good intentions by and large, are intentionally, cutting corners, but there is a profit incentive, and often with profit incentives comes an incentive to reduce costs, and sometimes that means cutting corners in the way that you do things. That's just a reality. And in the absence of regulation, I think you're more likely to see corner cutting, which, again, makes me a little bit concerned about the quality controls that just simply aren't in place. So again, just to be explicit, the fact that these clocks work, sort of, in the basic research setting or in basic science is not evidence that the kit that you buy from biologicalaging.com tells you anything real about anything real. So just don't be fooled by that. Okay, so now let's talk about accuracy and precision, because I think this is really the meat of what my experiment can give us some insights into. So accuracy is how close the measured value is to the true value. So in this case, the true value would be biological age, or at least epigenetic age. So the question we can ask is, how close is the number you get from the kit to the true epigenetic age, or the way they market it, biological age? Precision is something different. Precision is, if we take the same test and we do the measurement multiple times, how close are those values to each other? You could be very precise, have 5 measurements that are all really close to each other, but off by 50% from the true value, right? So think about, if you have a scale that's broken, you really weigh 150 pounds, but your scale says you weigh 100 pounds. If you get on that scale 5 times, you're going to get very precise measurements, most likely, that are way off from the true value. So that's kind of the difference between accuracy and precision. Again, if you think about the way I did this experiment, we've got 8 measurements. 2 are what are called technical replicates. So the same test from the same company, and then there are 4 companies. Okay, so we've got 8 measurements. So Precision, we can just look and see how close are those measurements to each other. That's pretty easy. Accuracy is harder because accuracy would be how close are those measurements to the true biological age. And unfortunately, this goes back to what I've talked about so far. We really don't have any good way to know what my true biological age was on the day that I took these tests. So no way to know that quantitatively, but we can qualitatively, I think, get some information that would tell us something about my biological age on the day that I took those tests. Just like these epigenetic marks have been correlated with outcomes that we think are relevant for biological age, or at least correlated with biological age. So things like risk of dying or risk of developing specific diseases. Again, both of those in the past have come from long-term observational studies. We can also look at things like VO2 max, body composition, blood-based biomarkers that we have reason to believe are relevant for health outcomes, HDL, LDL, insulin, glucose, things like that. So at least we get an idea of some things that correlate with biological age. Okay, so let's get to the data. So again, 4 different direct-to-consumer epigenetic age tests from 4 different companies, 2 replicates of each test, samples all taken on the same day at the same time. So the companies I tested were TruDiagnostic. I would say TruDiagnostic is the leader in the epigenetic testing space. This is the epigenetic testing platform that we currently use at Optispan. And so everything I've said and that I will say about these epigenetic tests, my skepticism, we do use an epigenetic test in our program at Optispan, always in combination with other data. So clearly, I believe there's some value to these tests, but I think we want to understand what can and can't we conclude from these tests. So we use TruDiagnostic. And the reason why we use TruDiagnostic is personally, I've been impressed with the people I know who work at the company. I think they're doing it for the right reasons. I think they're trying to do it right. At least to this point, they aren't selling supplements. And I've already talked about why I think that's a problem. I will say they've had a new CEO who I don't know personally. He is the founder of a company called Wild Health, which does market supplements among other things. So I'm a little bit concerned that this creates now a conflict of interest for both companies. Again, I don't know any of the details of the relationship, so this is all, removed, but it does raise some potential problems in my mind around conflict of interest and the way that those conflicts could influence how the test is used, developed, and marketed. Okay. The second kit that I used is from Elysium. Elysium was founded by my PhD advisor, Dr. Lenny Garenti. Elysium does sell several supplements, and they try to get you to buy their supplements based on their test. I've already talked about why I personally think that's problematic. The third kit that I tested is Tally Health. This is another supplement company that also sells an epigenetic age test. This company was co-founded by David Sinclair, who you, I'm sure, have all heard of. Their primary supplement includes resveratrol, which, as we've discussed on the podcast, is the most debunked longevity molecule in the world. So you can draw your own conclusions from that. And then the fourth kit that I tested is from DoNotAge.org. This is also another supplement company that sells a biological age test. I don't know much about DoNotAge.org. They also have been endorsed by a prominent scientist in the field, Vera Gorbanova at Rochester. I do wonder why they have a .org URL. I believe they're for-profit, but I could be wrong. Maybe it's a nonprofit. Again, I don't know much about them. I will say, honestly, their marketing bothers me when I get their emails, because just a lot of stuff that I kind of cringe at, like the Vera Gorbanova bundle, which includes, again, supplements for which there is essentially no evidence for benefits in people. I was a little surprised that when I got their test, it wasn't actually their test. It was from another company called Mudo Health, and that's the app that you get the results through. I didn't know anything about Mudo Health, but they appear to sell different diagnostic tests. I don't think they sell supplements. The app was pretty cool, I will say that. But I ordered it through DoNotAge.org. Okay, so there's the 4 kits. Again, 2 kits from each company. Collect the samples on the same day, send them in. Okay, so now let's think about biological age. What is my true biological age if we want to at least try to get some qualitative assessment of accuracy? We don't know what my biological age is. So some data that might be relevant. So on the day I took the test, I was 6 feet tall. I'm still 6 feet tall today. Weighed about 185 pounds. I was somewhere between 11.4 and 11.9% body fat. That's based on DEXA scans that spanned the day I did this experiment. My VO2 max is somewhere around the 90th percentile, maybe even a little bit better than that. I eat a pretty clean diet. I exercise regularly. I don't smoke. I've cut way back on alcohol consumption for about a year, down to certainly less than 1 drink a week on average. At the time, had no diagnosed chronic diseases, still have no diagnosed chronic diseases. Unlikely to have any significant cancers. That's based both on a multi-cancer liquid biopsy and whole body MRI. Also unlikely to have any significant heart, kidney, liver, or brain pathology, again, based on a variety of different types of diagnostics. So certainly not going to suggest I'm in perfect health. I'm not certainly not going to suggest my biomarkers are perfect. They're not. But all things being equal, I would say my biological functioning is pretty good for my chronological age. So let's just say unlikely to have a biological age older than my chronological age based on the information that we have at hand. Okay, how did the results come out? So let's look at TruDiagnostic first. This is the one that surprised me the most, and it surprised me because of the huge variation. Again, remember, exactly the same biological sample. In fact, for the tests that used blood, they came from exactly the same tube. The two results for their omic M age, which is their primary epigenetic age report, were 60.73 years and 47.80 years. They kind of span my true chronological age, which was 53.51. Again, really surprised me that they were so far apart. I'll come back and talk about that in a few minutes. The next one was Tally Health. Again, these two were very close together. So 61 years, 0 months, 59 years, 10 months. This is a saliva-based test, so their precision, again, only 2 replicates, but reasonably good, I guess. Almost 2 years difference between the two tests. Again, remember though, this is exactly the same sample. So a 2-year variance for exactly the same sample, is that good? I don't know. Elysium, also 2 years, but now on the other side of my chronological age, 45 and 43. So I don't know if we can draw any patterns at this point other than there doesn't really appear to be a pattern, right? So TruDiagnostic flanked my chronological age. Tally Health, 2 years apart, but above my chronological age. Elysium, 2 years apart, but below my chronological age. And then that 0.87 that they report here for rate of aging, I'm guessing that's the Dunedin Pace rate of aging metric. And I'll come back and talk about that from the TruDiagnostic results in a minute. Okay. And then the fourth test was this Mudo. Again, this one was actually really close together, 56.6 and 56.2. So precision looks pretty good. Again, a little bit above my chronological age. So if we look at the summary statistics, again, 2 technical replicates times 4 companies. There's a few different ways you can look at this. Very simple. True chronological age, 53.1. Mean epigenetic age across all tests, 53.8. So I guess we can say if you take the test 8 times, you can get pretty close to your chronological age, but the standard deviation is enormous. So 7.4 years across these 8 replicates for standard deviation. So it's kind of noisy. And if we look at this in a graphical way, you can see the spread around the true chronological age. Again, we don't know if the true chronological age is the true biological age, is the true epigenetic age, but again, based on the other health information that we've got, it seems unlikely that the true biological age is much greater than the true chronological age and might be a little bit less. Okay. Now we can also look at this based on the color-coded by the companies. Again, you can see there's pretty good spread, sort of all over the place in terms of where the individual results come back. But in average, they get pretty close to the true chronological age. So my interpretation of this is that these epigenetic age tests across the industry as a whole are more noise than signal. And I don't think, based on this, from a single replicate, you can really conclude anything useful. Knowing that if you were to take the test 8 times, you might get a spread like this, which looks more or less normally distributed around the chronological age. So I'm not aware of anybody else doing this. If other people have, I'd love to see the data. We can compare the data. But to me, this is pretty clear. There's a lot of noise in the system. Okay, so there's a little bit more to the story here. One of the questions I was interested in, I was wondering as I was doing this, whether or not these companies use the other information that you're giving them to predict your biological age. They shouldn't, right? If this is based truly on an epigenetic signature, it should be independent of anything else that you tell them. It should be only based on the epigenetic signature. But all of these companies ask you things about your lifestyle. What kind of diet do you eat? Do you exercise regularly? Do you smoke? Do you drink alcohol? Turns out you can actually even identify signatures of drug and alcohol consumption and different types of diet within the epigenetic profile. Of course, they could also get your genome information from your DNA. So they ask you for that stuff. And it occurred to me, they might actually bias their algorithms based on these other things that you're telling them. So I didn't have any great way to test this in the context of what I was doing, a super small N. Some of the companies you can't really, if whoever orders the test has to be the person who uses the test. So I couldn't really spoof some of the companies, but for two of them, I did give them a little bit of misinformation. So for one of the tests, I gave my true information, whatever questions they asked, my true chronological age. And then for one of the tests, those tests were completed by Johnny Optispan, my pseudonym. Johnny is just like me, except he's 20 years younger. So his chronological age that was reported was 33.51 years old. And I was able to do that for the Elysium tests and the TruDiagnostic tests. This could actually explain the huge variance in the TruDiagnostic test, because the one that came back at 47.8 was Johnny's test, where they were told that he was 33.51 years old. So in that case, the delta, the difference between the reported age and the measured age, the epigenetic age, was 14 years. And then for the reported age of 53, the difference was 7 years. I have no idea. Again, no way to know, possible. But with Elysium, because the results both came back as 43 and 45 years, it can't explain anything. So I don't know if it means anything. I'm sure somebody will tell me if it does from the companies, but that is a note added in proof, perhaps, that's worth noting. Okay. The other sanity check we can do is look over time. And for TruDiagnostic, because we've been using this at Optispan for a while now, I actually have longitudinal data over time. And so we can ask the question, does it make sense? So unfortunately, in the TruDiagnostic PDF, the graphic that you're seeing is the graphic that they have in the PDF, which makes absolutely no sense because it goes from December 2022 to August 2024 to November 2023 to October 2023 to April 2024. I got no idea. I have to assume this is some glitch in the way that their system is working. So I took this data and I replotted it with the dates actually going in calendar order. I only used the result from this duplicate experiment, the higher result that went with my reported age of 53. You could imagine if I'd put both of them on there, you'd have a lower one as well. Okay, so the reason why I did this was I thought it would be interesting now to look at my, the aging rate I would need to have between the time points if this is actually an accurate measure of biological age or epigenetic age. So if we look between my first measurement in December 2022 and my second one in October 2023, we look at the change in my epigenetic age. And so what's shown here is the difference between the chronological age at that time and the epigenetic age. So for the first one, my epigenetic age came back 6 years higher than my chronological age. For the second one, it came back 7 point some years lower than my chronological age. If that's true, I had to have aged in reverse at a rate of 15.8 times the normal passage of chronological time. So I was kicking ass for that year. But then something happened in October to November 2023. Honestly, I don't remember anything bad happening that month. But if we accept this as some sort of real measure, I aged forwards at an accelerated 140-fold times chronological time. So I don't know what to say. I need to really go back and think hard about what happened in that month. And then since then, I've been aging at a more sedate 3.8-fold the passage of chronological time. Again, obviously, there are big questions about the accuracy of these numbers. Let's just assume it's true for a minute. And I do think one of the things that seems apparent, even from the peer-reviewed literature, where at least there should have been some guardrails on quality control and replicability, is that you see sort of wild fluctuations in these epigenetic age measurements. And the reason why I'm noting this is, if that's true, if there are sort of dynamic changes in epigenetic age, and those tell us something about biological age up and down, I think that means that we've been thinking about biological aging in a very incomplete way. If it can change dramatically over short periods of time, and I don't have a great model in my head, but I'm sort of gravitating to the idea that there are multiple dimensions to biological aging. There's at least one dimension that looks like, at least the way I've been thinking about it, where it's this sort of gradual change. We can think of it as an increase in damage, increase in risk, loss of homeostasis over time. It probably is not linear. It probably looks like something exponential. But then there's this other dimension that can go up and down, right? And maybe that's what these tests, at least as they're designed today, are more measuring. And maybe that's what we think of as health, right? Or at least the biggest aspect of health, and at least the aspect of health that is largely modifiable. Again, I say this all the time. The fact that people can get healthier, we've known that for decades, right? If you take somebody who's obese and sedentary, eating a crappy diet, not exercising, not sleeping well, has no human relationships to speak of, and you get them to focus on all of those things, or at least a subset of those things, they will get healthier. Their biomarkers will go the right direction. I expect their epigenetic age within the variance in the system, the noise in the system, will get better. Did they age in reverse? I'm not ready to go there yet, although I know some people are, but they got healthier. And maybe that's what we're picking up on with these sort of dynamic changes in the tests. Unfortunately, I think what I've concluded from my experiment here is that there are so many problems in the industry that it's hard to know what's noise and what's signal. I will say my Dunedin PACE score over this time frame has been less than 1, meaning that I should have been aging biologically at a rate less than the passage of chronological time, which doesn't explain the sort of wild variation in aging rate that we see here. Okay, so what can we conclude? Again, I think there's some major problems clearly in the direct-to-consumer biological age testing industry, and I've hit those. I think the conflicts of interest are real. I think the lack of transparency around quality control, variation in tests, and I think the results of this experiment clearly point out that there are real issues and that it is very, very difficult for me to have confidence that you can get signal from the noise, certainly not based on a single test at any given time. I'm not convinced it's much better than a random normal distribution around chronological age at this point. And unfortunately, it seems like the industry, at least to date, is unable to self-regulate. So I'd really encourage the folks at these companies, and I know many of them are really well-intentioned, to start providing some transparency into quality control, replicability, and remove the conflicts of interest where they are selling tests and then also selling other products, particularly supplements or other interventions that are sold based on the results of the tests. I think that just creates way too much opportunity for abuse. I also have to ask, to the scientists who are, plastering their faces on these tests, what are you thinking? Is the money worth it? What sort of message are you sending to your graduate students, your postdocs, your trainees, when you are endorsing this kind of noise, lack of scientific noise? I don't get it personally, and I just have to ask, is it really worth the damage to your reputation? I don't know. Maybe it is. For the consumers, again, for you, I'd really recommend that you carefully consider, why is it that you believe whatever it is you believe about these tests? If you believe they work, if you believe they're telling you something about your health, why do you believe that? If you find these tests to be motivational, that they help you practice a healthy lifestyle, think more about the pillars of health, great, fantastic. If they create stress, not so fantastic. And I will say, even though as a scientist, I can look at this data and go, this looks like random noise, the fact that so many of my tests came out on the wrong side of my chronological age, right? Saying that I'm, epigenetically older than my chronological age, even though the rational part of my mind is like, you can't conclude anything from that. The emotional part of me is like, shit, I wonder if I'm actually, biologically older than I should be, despite the fact that I'm doing all this stuff to try to improve my health. And despite the fact that my biomarkers, my functionality is going in the right direction. That's not a great thing for health span. And so if these tests are creating any sort of anxiety or any sort of negative reinforcement, again, really encourage you to think about, is it worth it, given that they probably aren't telling you anything real at all? And also, I'd speculate that given the results that I got, a lot of these influencers who are sharing their biological age data out there, these rejuvenation Olympics, they may just be sharing the data that they want you to see. If you take the same test 3-4 times, I suspect, based on what I saw, you might be able to get the number that you want. It wouldn't shock me if some of these folks are leaving out the results that don't fit their narrative. In fact, if I, instead of showing you the results that I showed you today, wanted you to believe that my protocol is a great protocol, I could have just shown you my Elysium results. I didn't do that, but you might want to wonder whether some of these folks would do that. Are they doing that? I don't know the answer, but it wouldn't surprise me. So for now, personally, again, I think about whether these tests are useful to you. Are they motivating you? Are they creating anxiety? Why do you believe them? Why don't you believe them? And I'd put much more faith in the things that we know are informative about biological age and health, the pillars of health: eat, move, sleep, connect. Biomarkers that have years, sometimes decades of clinical evidence to support them, large-scale epidemiological studies. And for now, I'd largely ignore the direct-to-consumer epigenetic age test, especially in isolation. I think it's an open question. Will these tests have value when combined with a much larger data set? I'm hopeful, and I'm hopeful that they will get better. But at this point, I'm not sure. It's still an open question. So hopefully this at least gives you something to think about. And as always, if you have any comments, questions, please feel free to leave them below, to reach out. I'm really interested to see what people think about this episode. And I'm sure that we will cover this topic in greater detail in future episodes on the Optispan podcast. Thanks for watching.